Hundreds of millions of Americans right now are finding themselves in the new affordability crisis. Although it feels like we've been going through this for quite some time, the cost of living crisis is something that's very well known to those who have actually been experiencing it. But what we're seeing is the mainstream media actually come out and give it a kind of validation that it is something that the people are going through. And with the government shutdown ending, it's not exactly like flipping a switch. People are still struggling. There's still a lot of scarcity when it comes to resources. The job market is still in a dire situation, and people are finding themselves really struggling just to pay for the bare essentials at the grocery stores. And it looks like this is something that might drag through the holiday season.
Economic promises helped Donald Trump get reelected. Well, now he has an affordability problem, and his administration is facing backlash from consumers over the cost of living. CBS's Allie Bauman in New York has more on efforts to bring some relief. Allie, good evening.
Good evening, Jerika. Many families are calling it a crisis of affordability. A new report by the American Family Survey finds 7 in 10 Americans think raising children is too expensive.
We say, the impacts of an affordability crisis or cost of living crisis really put the American people in a position where they can't build towards a future. I mean, not even talk about the American dream, because that's something that it's so elusive at this point that it almost feels disrespectful to talk about. It's almost like pumping yourself up, pumping up the population to strive for something that is almost unattainable, except for a very select few people within the population. But it's true. We are having a crisis when it comes to our population. No one is having kids. And the biggest reason for that is simply affordability. When we look at how much it actually costs just to sustain the household for a family of 4, and where I'm at in Florida right now, that price tag is over $200,000 per year. Because even if you have both people in the house, because even if you have 2 people in the household working, the childcare costs in this country, especially in the more populated areas, can go up to $70,000 to $80,000 a year just for 2 kids. And with the breakdown of the American family, the kind of support system that families usually were able to rely on, so they wouldn't have to fall back on expensive childcare, it just isn't there anymore. So the breakdown of the family in America is now being accelerated by the affordability crisis. And the impacts that that's going to have in the future, we really have not even explored yet.
Even after the government reopened this week, hundreds lined up at a grocery giveaway in Tampa, Florida, still struggling following weeks without federal food aid.
It's going to take time. You have to, rob Peter to pay Paul. It's either food or lights.
Nearly a year into President Trump's second term, food and housing costs have surged.
You just expect when you leave the house that whatever you're planning for, you're probably going to spend more.
Yesterday, the president signed an executive order lifting his own tariffs on dozens of foods in an attempt to bring prices down. The price of beef never higher. Coffee, the most expensive it's been in half a century. Bananas up more than 8% over the last year. Food economist David Ortega.
Kind of the worst part of that is, while at the same time Americans are being gaslit by an administration that's telling us that the cost of groceries are down, that the cost of living is actually down, that they don't actually want to hear about affordability because it's just a con. It's something that's being used by the Democrats to tarnish the reputation of this administration. But for anyone who actually has to go out and go to the store, anyone who has to pay rent, anyone who's in the market to buy a home for the first time, even though the age of a first-time home buyer in this country has now reached 40 years old, and only 21% of homes in this country right now are actually owned by first-time buyers. The affordability crisis is felt by pretty much everyone at this point. And there's a very dangerous part to this, because it leads to a massive distrust in the government, even more so than we do now. I mean, no one trusts the government. No one trusts the numbers that are coming out, especially as, the agencies that report these numbers to the American people, managing officials are being switched out for people who are simply being put in that position because they're more loyal and not more qualified. And this affects the behavior of the American people. Psychologically, it affects the behavior of the American people because we're not going to spend as much, and that is not good for a consumer economy. If people don't know if there's going to be job security, if federal workers come back, hundreds of thousands of federal workers come back, not knowing if the government's going to be shut down in just a few more months, and who's to say that it isn't, then that kind of comfort that Americans usually have to go out and spend money, especially over the holiday season, which is one of the most profitable times for corporations in this country, that spending just isn't going to be the same. So the quarterly reports that come out in just a few months are going to make the market tank. And this is at the same time where we're seeing consumer sentiment in our economy, the lowest that it's been in recorded history. We are in an affordability crisis. And the impacts of the government shutdown really happening at the worst time possible are going to drag on, not just in the economy, but in the psychology of the people and how they spend.
Take that tariff away, that is going to reduce the inflationary pressures, but it's still going to take some time for those prices to come down.
Voters overwhelmingly.
And that's true. You know, when the tariffs actually happened last spring, when they were put in place, there wasn't an immediate impact. And this, of course, led to the arguments that, oh, tariffs don't actually have an impact on goods. But what we've seen since then, because corporations and companies all throughout the United States built up their inventory in a way to try to outlast the tariffs, hoping that there was some kind of a trade deal that would have happened, those prices were spread throughout all goods at stores and markets. So what we saw was a gradual increase over the months leading to where we are now, where there hasn't been a decrease like we were promised when it comes to groceries, when it comes to necessities, when it comes to housing. Instead, the American people have only seen it rise, and it's going to take time. So you can cut tariffs on bananas, beefs, and coffee, but at the same time, it's not going to have the immediate effect that the economy actually needs. And a stimulus check isn't going to help as well. Because what Americans actually learned between the time of 2020 and 2022 is that anytime a stimulus check is actually paid out, anytime money is thrown into the system, that money will always find its way to the wealthiest people in America. And that's consolidation, that transfer of wealth from the American people to the wealthiest people in the United States will just happen again and again. And as the Fed prints more money, the money becomes more devalued. So even though it might be a nice reprieve for a large majority of people out there, $2,000 can really help. The long-term damage that can actually cost, and it's a long-term damage that cannot be reversed. Because if there's one thing that we know about this country, if there's one thing we know about this economy, if there's one thing we know about the markets, is the prices will continue to go up, but there's no way for them to go back down. The people have to catch up with the economy, but the people are never actually given the time to do so. The economy moves so aggressively because of policy and because of decisions that come not just from this administration, not just from lobbyists, but from an agreed upon agenda by the corporations that really run our country at this point. Because like we see, although there's an affordability crisis, we're still seeing profits at sky high levels for corporations, feeding more bonuses during an affordability crisis, higher bonuses to CEOs, to shareholders, higher dividends being paid out. While at the same time, the people struggle. While at the same time, the people line up at food banks that are constantly seeing the goods that they're receiving, the donations, the supplies that are supposed to be funded by the USDA. These things have been reduced in some places up to 40%. Right now, I'm in Margate, Florida, a part of southern Florida in Broward County. And it's definitely not a cheap place to live. But I can tell you right now that in a recent interview by one of the local food banks here, they said that donations to the food bank actually went down 40% over the past year. And we have to ask ourselves why that is. And that's simply because the affordability crisis. If people can barely make ends meet, if people, no matter how charitable they are in their hearts, don't have the ability to have the extra income that they can actually donate, that's going to have an impact on the food that's actually available at local pantries, at food banks. And this is something that we're seeing not just here in Florida, it's something that we're seeing all over the United States right now. I saw this recent article in USA Today, and it really kind of talks about the situation as far as the hardships that a lot of food banks across the country are facing right now. It says, the fallout's going to be huge, and I don't think we really have wrapped our heads around it yet. The food bank said they expect to feel the impacts of the shutdown for months, even though the federal government reopened Thursday evening. And soon the benefits will resume flowing to tens of millions of federal food assistance recipients, and paychecks will arrive for hundreds of thousands of federal workers. But those people used up what reserves they had during the 43-day shutdown, said the president and COO of Feeding America, which provides millions of meals of food support to organizations across the country. It will take substantial time for people to feel financially secure enough to stop using food banks. While our government may have reopened, the impacts are not like a light switch. We can't magically go back to before times and everything feel normal. For people whose lives have been extraordinarily disrupted, it will take time for neighbors to be able to even out their household finances over the course of many coming paychecks. So again, we get into the kind of trust and uncertainty that Americans are feeling right now. Is when the USDA announced in late October that the well has run dry and there would be no SNAP benefits in November. It was the first time the federal food security had not arrived in the program's more than 60-year history. Cutting off SNAP benefits shook people who had faith in the government to provide a safety net. Because the one certainty that folks had for a long time was, regardless of what else was happening, we'll have SNAP benefits. We can provide for our families. There's no certainty now. I don't have it. When you shake people, it takes a while to recover. Until the benefits actually arrive on people's EBT cards, the debit card facsimile used by SNAP recipients, she's going to act as if it isn't coming. Her food bank usually distributes 1 million pounds of food a month. And they distribute that much in the first week of November alone. She said the only reason the food bank actually made it through was the governor sent money, the National Guard, to help. Some people may be warily looking at the next funding deadline, which Congress set at fewer than 3 months away. The bill to reopen the government partially funds the federal government for nearly a full year and provides the Department of Agriculture with funding through September 2026. But the problem with this, of course, is because we see the cuts happening almost randomly all throughout the economy and all throughout the government right now. So it does keep people on edge, not knowing if SNAP's going to be cut off for some reason or it's going to be used as a political tool again to further one party's agenda. Carlson said people have to juggle their mortgage, utilities, and other bills for more than a month, and it will take time for them to feel settled again. People still need to eat, and so they're going to be continuing to rely on the pantries until they get themselves stabilized. In a normal week, her food bank would distribute about 350,000 pounds of food during the shutdown. There were single days where they distributed that amount. Carlson expects the high need level to continue through at least the end of the year. Possibly in January, we might see a little bit of decline. We'll see how that goes. Like I said, there's a great impact on this because food insecurity in this country right now has already been spreading even before the cuts to EBT and SNAP. It's simply because the cost of food has been going up and job insecurity has been rising in the United States. With regular layoffs happening for millions of Americans right now, we're seeing that once they hit the job market, it takes months and months and months for them to actually get a job. And finding a job with a livable wage in this country is becoming more elusive as ever. So the article continues, with inflation making food more expensive and cost of living going up across the board, food banks and pantries were already seeing huge demand before the shutdown, said Jilly Stevens of City Harvest in New York City. In 2019, City Harvest saw 25 million visits to the food pantry, she said. In 2024, they saw a near doubling of the 47 million. Like we said, the cost of living crisis in America is something that's been going on for a while. And the data that's going to come out from 2025 is really going to change things. We're seeing numbers across the board. What are we really seeing when we're seeing these record-breaking numbers across the board right now? Everything's being compared to what? 2008 crisis, but they're saying it's going to be worse than the 2008 crisis. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. That's why I always tell people that you need to go out and prepare. You need to prepare your pantries as much as you can by getting as much shelf-stable food as possible. Learn how to cook in the time that you have to learn how to cook before scarcity has a chance to actually set in. Beans and rice are a big thing in our household. It's something that we love. If you grew up poor like I did, you have a hard time shaking the poverty mindset, and it does come to benefit sometimes. So I would highly recommend a lot of people out there just learn a couple recipes. You don't have to break out a cookbook and learn how to make beef Wellington. It's not something you have to do, but you learn how to feed yourself and learn how to use ingredients that are meant to sit in the closet, sit in the pantry, sit in the cupboard for months or years at a time. It's just a nice backup to have. And it's not expensive to get these things. Listen, oil, rice, beans, these things are some of the cheapest things that you can actually get at the grocery store. I would always recommend that people have at least a few weeks, or if possible, a couple of months worth of food, even if it's not the tastiest food. You know, you can always get some corned beef, tuna, you know, freeze-dried meats, freeze-dried vegetables, things that you can throw in there. Like I said, is it going to be the most appetizing? No, but having food, if your household is about to go through a famine, is invaluable. Roughly 14% of households reported food insecurity on average between January and October, up from 12.5 in 2024. According to the latest data from Purdue's Center for Food Demand Analysis and Sustainability, the overall rate has been declining since 2022, at the height of the pandemic, when an average of 15.4% of households were food insecure. So we're getting to the point where we're almost at the pandemic levels, but there's nothing happening. So what happens if we actually go to war with Venezuela? What happens if we have, you know, another black swan event, you know, that really makes the economy nosedive? If we're this close to pandemic levels, we have to recognize that our economy is facing its own pandemic. But it doesn't feel like, and it doesn't seem like, there's actually an attempt to find a cure or vaccine for the financial hardships that Americans are actually going through right now. Purdue researchers define food insecurity as some members of a household at times not being able to afford a balanced meal, as well as occasionally having to skip a meal or eating less for financial reasons. And of course, my problem with this, obviously, as a father, is children, as we see childhood food insecurity just blow up across the United States right now. Purdue's survey has become one of the few remaining national measures of food insecurity after the USDA canceled its annual household food security survey in September, which has been conducted since 2001. USDA said in September that its survey was redundant, costly, politicized, and extraneous. And this is one of the things I worry about, of course, is as the numbers continue to look bad, that one of the strategies that people in power will use to remain in power and to make sure that they get voted back in is to hide the numbers, or to rig the numbers in their favor. And that is one of the worries of people in the United States right now. And again, this leads to a massive distrust in the system itself. Food banks and pantries were also dealing with more than $1 billion in federal funding cuts and pauses USDA made in the spring as part of Elon Musk's Doge attempt to downsize the government. USDA paused half of the funding, or $500 million, for the Emergency Food Assistance and Nutrition Program that purchased food from American farmers for emergency food providers. Some of the funding was later restored. So again, this consequence isn't just on the table of people, it hurts our agricultural sector as well. And this is something that we talked about last spring when this cut was actually done, and how the impacts that it would have on the American farmer. And that was before, you know, the impacts of the tariffs that really caused the fracture of the trading agreements that we saw between American farmers and China. So it's just one thing on top of the other, which essentially is just going to crater the agricultural economy in America, leading to more bankruptcies and more foreclosures of farms. And again, this is something that should be worried about, because as we see that massive wealth transfer in America continue to happen, what we see is that massive corporations and the wealthiest people in America are becoming the largest landowners in America. It's not the mega farm we need to worry about. It's the corporations that are actually hoarding up all these assets. When Bill Gates becomes the largest owner of farmland held in the United States, it should become a red flag when discussing kind of the narrative. When the funding was cut, the Missoula Food Bank lost 40% of what they expected to receive for that year, or about 91,000 pounds of food. It cost about $200,000 to replace that much food. Other food banks provided similar numbers. The USDA also canceled a local food purchase assistance program, which helped food banks buy fresh food directly from local farmers. It would have funded about $500 million this year for the food banks. We're struggling with food, and then when you go lower food and higher demand, that's just a recipe that is not going to work out. Even with the pandemic, we didn't experience anything like that we've gone through since the first part of October. And of course, with the government coming back online, essentially, there have been changes to SNAP. And And by changes, we mean new requirements. At the beginning of the year, you're going to see basically every recipient's going to have to reapply for their SNAP benefits. And this is to try to weed out fraud. But the new requirements put a lot of challenges on people. So what you're going to see is essentially a lot of people are going to end up losing their SNAP benefits because they can't actually meet those requirements. And it's not always going to be because it's fraud. It's just going to be because some people are just either too old, too unhealthy, or just in general kind of unable to meet those requirements for whatever reasons they might have. So inevitably, this is going to cause food insecurity to rise. This is going to cause hunger to rise. This will cause childhood food insecurity to rise, regardless of whether SNAP is funded or not, because we're just going to give it to less people. And if less people are getting those benefits and those same people can't actually work or get a job, then they will go hungry. And with the food banks going dry, with the pantries going dry, with the lack of trust in the system where more and more people are depending on these food banks, the social safety net, in order to just survive at this point. It paints a very dire and bleak future for a lot of people in the United States right now. In early November, new work requirements took effect that Congressional Budget Office estimates will reduce SNAP participation by 2.4 million recipients. For the first time in the program's history, states will be required, starting in 2028, to contribute to SNAP benefits if they have a payment error rate above 6%. Error rates were about 11% nationally in 2024. As those changes roll out, we know that there will be more people who lose their SNAP benefits and will need to rely more deeply on the charitable food systems like food banks, local food pantries, and churches. So we're extraordinarily concerned about that. People across the country will lose benefits that have been keeping food on the table, and they will face uncertainty again. The nation's loose network of food banks and pantries is not designed to replace federal food assistance, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. He and more than 24 other states sued the Trump administration to provide full November SNAP benefits. SNAP is the way that Americans help feed other Americans and the food shelves and others who do such a wonderful job. Allison said community support has given the Missoula Food Bank a buffer to get through the holiday season. Still, she is concerned about making it to the end of the fiscal year in June. She said the coming months she needs Missoula's community to continue to show up and support the food bank financially with fresh foods, including dairy and protein. I think the food banks in general and ourselves definitely need to continue to see people in the community showing up as much as possible, she said. All right. So it's continuing to get more difficult. And like I said, these food banks, with the increase of people, the increase of traffic that they have going to these charitable societies, while at the same time, a massive decrease in funding and support from the community, as well as the government, just means that the food just isn't there like it used to be. So in some communities, like here in Margate, there's reports saying that just what's in the boxes when you go to pick it up is going down by 30-40%. And that's not to talk about the kind of food that's in it. It's not to talk about the nutritional value. Because one of the good things about having the government assistance that actually had these food banks buy from farmers is that fresh produce was going to be in these boxes. People and children, even though they may not be getting the same caloric intake that they may need, at least they're getting the nutritional value that we find often to be devoid in the super processed, shelf-stable, sugary sweet treats that food banks will often see as an alternative. But either way, the people are seeing this affordability crisis for what it is. And for the most part, it's the result of bad policy, bad monetary policy, irresponsible politicians, and a complete disregard for the well-being of the American people, as per usual. But if you're still here at this point, like and subscribe. Think about becoming a member. Donations are always welcome on the channel. This is something that I think we're going to see a consequence of this happen more and more as people just can't continue to donate as they used to. And as the funding continues to be cut, I think we're going to start seeing food banks shut down. And that's going to leave entire areas to go without that kind of support that they actually just need to survive. And the consequences of that can be dire. But thank you for stopping by as always, and we hope you have a good one.